Unfortunately, a true story of a young man who travels and works in one of the Gulf countries, but he is followed like a slave into desert tending to sheep, and what happened to him shows the cruelty of the sponsor, and what they do to poor people. A shocking story by all standards. Without spoilers, ready for shark will know the events of the film begin with a group of camels in the middle of a severe sandstorm, very, very dark after a while, and we see a young man like Han in a bad condition with very long hair and a black face like a slave drinking from the basin from which sheep drank. In order to understand the reason behind this, let us take the story from the beginning, and we will see a simple young man named Nib standing at the airport, and the Saudi officer is examining his papers and asking him, "Are you coming? What are you doing here?" Because Nib did not understand Arabic, he did not know how to respond to him, and when he tried to speak to him in English hoping that it would be a common language between them, he was also white and did not know how to respond because he only knew an Indian. Then a wise friend joined him who knew the English language to the best of his abilities. He translated to the officer and said that they were coming to work in one of the companies and getting the stamp upon their passports and finally entering the kingdom. After that, I and Hakim went to look for the sponsor, who was supposed to be waiting for them, or any piece of paper in the reception hall with their names written on it, but to no avail. After that, Najib went and made a call to the office where they were supposed to belong. The kingdom had bad luck. Friday was an official holiday in the city, of course. In the end, the two of them left, their eyes full of confusion, and they smelled left and right, hoping that it would be enough for them to arrive, but to no avail, and they remained standing until they noticed a Saudi man entering the airport. He thought that he was their sponsor, and after a while, the person who we are suspicious of this, and the one whose name was tailed, spoke to an Arab and asked if there was one of them named Abdullah, but they did not understand him, so he spent the afternoon following them and walking and leaving. Then he decided to take advantage of them. When he knew that they were lost, he looked at their passports and took them from them and walked away with all arrogance. They dragged the two of them after him. So he took their bags and put them in their bags. The Karen Na asked the sponsor about some water to drink, but he did not understand what he wanted and told them to ride in the box from behind, but they did not understand his words and went to ride next to him in the cabin in front, but he became angry with them and told them to ride behind. And when they got off, Hakim asked Nit, "Why is this man so fanatical? This shocked us, man. I'm thinking about standing there and coming back. It's not enough for a few words from the beginning, so we answer and say to him, get in, may God guide you. We couldn't believe that she came out with us." Then they get into the box and the car moves through the streets of the kingdom. They are amazed by his beautiful appearance and completely forgot to call any of their families to reassure themselves they arrived in the kingdom safely. The important thing is that the car started to enter the desert and Naj started putting something on his head due to the extreme cold until finally they arrive after 6 continuing hours in the desert. Then Hakim demanded that he go down alone in one of the sheep farms, and Na started screaming because Hakim broke up with him, and this is because he knows they would be together, and they were supposed to be in a city, not in the desert. Najib was forced to return to the car again to continue his journey with the sponsor Tali. After several continuous hours inside the dark, the car, Sto, and Talib let Najib go down to a very strange place in the middle of the dark in a single tent, and the Junner, Talib's nephew, his name is Hed, and Ni passes by and sleeps anywhere until morning. Poor Najib tried to talk to them that he and Hakim are supposed to work as assistants in a company, but unfortunately no one understood anything of his language. What is strange is that Najib notices the presence of an old man named Aim in the place and speaks the same language as he asks Nib, who told him to come to work in the place he was in. This place was a great disaster for him. Then Nib drinks from the tank, hand breaks free from one of the camels that came close to him. Suddenly Najib finds that it is very cold, so he decides to enter Said's tent and sleep inside it on NES, and in seconds his eyes went away. He fell asleep from fatigue and drained the old days when he was working as a fisherman at sea. At this time, Najib heard his friends talking about work visas for the Gulf for a large sum. After a few days, Najib went home and collected the money and went to deliver it to the person who issued the visas in his village. At that time, Najib tried to let this person know that he would be merciful in his case because he bet his house to collect the amount of the visa, but he assures Nib that he will never deceive him because they are from the same village. Then we see Ni's wife, whose name is Sarah, with his mother inside a very simple cook hand, prevents themselves from eating sweet food every once in a while, so Sarah tells her mother-in-law to be patient until Ani travels with food for themselves in it, and then Ani wakes up from his sleep terrified, and all coffee all hold beats him, and the tent veterinarian says to him, "Come on dog, are you going to be friends with me, or what?" And he was very disgusted with him, unfortunately. Nid goes out to sleep in the extreme cold on the morning of the second day. Nid wakes up to the old man's great voice, and he disintegrates in his appearance during the day, when he sees his beard is very long, as if it were a slate has been at Sahar for years, and then Aim offers milk to Nii, and poor N, he remembers why he brought it, so he drinks it out of hunger, but Aim shouts at him and takes it from him a second time, telling him that it is for the sponsor. In fact, Na enters the sponsor's tent and wakes up with stupid looks and drinks the milk in a disgusting and very provocative way. Then call it sponsor Beamer Najib took over his work in sheep herding with the old man is great, and Anai is trying to explain to him that this is not the job he is coming for. Tirer says he has mercy on him and lets him walk because he sold everything and came to the kingdom to work in a company. He is not a shepherd, that the sponsor is teasing him because he did not understand anything about him, and I see that he is fussy and speaks quickly, as is the norm among Indians. Immediately after that, the second sponsor arrives, a student in Arabic, and Jib runs to us to have mercy on him from what he is in, but he cursed before he could speak and started carrying dags over his shoulder, and we hear Anai holding his hand over his neighbor, who ended over the visa. This is because he deceived him and told him that he would work in a company, and here they started shouting at Najib, so he goes to see his work and he is still being rude and Peter angry, but none of them were able to express it, so he runs and opens his bag and takes out a passport and some papers and presents the sponsor to a student, but the student is very afraid and cuts all the papers and flies in the air and continues to pick up the clips of papers like a madman and sits helpless and cries, and hours later he goes to bed for consultation. He is a student and offers him a piece of bread as if they're stimulating the genes of slavery inside him, because they treat him a little hly and a little kindly. Porn used to eat with tears streaming down his cheek. After he finished, Najib runs to Aim and asks about the exact name of the place they are in, or a map of the desert. So Aim tells him that they are outside, choosing life exactly in a country like this. He tells him that the magic inside it is lost and the outside is bore. At the end of this dreary day, Nij dreams of his wife Sa and his mother, and he thinks about them saying goodbye to the train station. When he enters the train station, he encounters Hakim. By chance, there is Hakim's father, who advises Jai about her son because he is weak and very kind. And when the train moves, as he was going to the airport, MCD started saying goodbye to his wife with very sad looks because they were newlyweds. The next morning, NB woke up early and was relieving himself like any other human being and using water, but enough for Gob for a student to shout at him and tell him that they buy water. The solution is to buy water with money. Water is for drinking, not for washing. By God, if you touch the pipe a second time, I will cut off your hand. Ain consults him and tells him to use sand instead of water. Hours later, a young man arrives with a water cart. He fills the tank. Hand Nib approaches him. They ask about their whereabouts or whether he is helping him escape, but suddenly a student arrives and they ask violently. He was asking the water person about what? And suddenly a student started. He hit Nabe with the whip around the headband, and when Anai tried to hold it and defend himself, Tali felt insulted. Oh, I hope you Abdu will also at the end of time touch your head with my head and try to resist me. He ran to the tent and brought a rifle and tried to get rid of Nib, but Nib also defended himself and grabbed the rifle and was hit. He pressed his head to the edge of the weapon and fainted. He fell to the ground, and the tank was completely filled with water coming down next to N's head. Kier nostalgia takes hold of him. He brings back memories with his wife in the river in the days of their beautiful engagement. Oh, how beautiful they were, similar to the freedoms of the sea. Najib was a poor young man whose dreams in his country were lost, and NB was a poor young man. His dreams of a country have been lost, and he is unable to live a decent life. He also thinks about Anai on his wedding night with Saria, and this is after a long love story that ended with marriage on the sands of the river surrounding the village. We return to the city a second time. What is the difference between the sands of the river and the sands of the burning kingdom? Nabe screams against the nations of injustice and oppression and asks a great deal about the number of years he spent as a slave in the desert, but Aim tells him that he does not remember anything, but it is certain that it is impossible to leave this desert, and after that Najib sleeps in a scrap car in the desert to protect himself from the burning fire of the sun, and he wakes up to the sponsor's provocative voices and annoying accent while he is asking him. He milked the goats immediately, and that was it. NB surrendered and started milking the goats for the first time, but they started to shake violently and fell on his back amidst laughter and mockery from the sponsor Hold and NWI learning, and began to graze the sheep with his stick hand cover the sand, and because he was inexperienced the sheep were fighting because he was a stranger, and they did not take care of him. Unfortunately, he fainted, and after a while he came. The sponsor is a student and throws water on his face to awe him. He gives him a very small amount of water and withdraws from his bag when he feels that he will finish. When he asks for Nib, he goes to the hospital. Talib makes fun of him as if he had finished. Abdo bought him. Weeks and months passed for Nid, and his hair became long and his beard was very thick, full of sand, and by chance his eye he comes into the cars. Moran loses his appearance as if he has become another version of the old man. Then NWI decided to break his mirror and take her, and shave his beard with it, but unfortunately the matter turned out to be very difficult, and he continued to cry his heart out and look up to heaven, praying to God for salvation and revenge on the oppressors who give blessings. And then N went crazy and decided to run in the middle of the sand and mountains. He commits suicide, but suddenly a message comes to him from God in the form of an eagle, preventing him from committing suicide. After that, NID notices a large gathering of vultures around his body, and he runs and succeeds in separating them from afar, and he believes that the old woman's name is Aim. Dared under the sand, and Sir preferred to attack NID from every direction ferociously and vigorously. She bites into him and is about to devour his flesh until he gives up. Han decides to leave Azim's body, and then Thade comes back crying as he eats from a jar his wife used to make him food in it, and she gave it to him as if he was trying to think of something from the smell of the old days when it was not safe, and he could not imagine that the world had human monsters. At the terrible dawn one morning, Nib ran from among the sheep in the vast desert. He is about to escape, but unfortunately a student sees him and runs after him as quickly as possible with a camel, and he also fires at him randomly until he leaves him in his leg. Unfortunately, the cursed sponsor decided to break all of Nib limbs, and they shoot him with the back of a rifle on his leg, hand, and head. This is of course a punishment for him because he thought of escaping, and then Nib was tied up in the middle of the sheep by his hands and tried to free himself and reach the water to drink before he died of thirst due to the extreme heat of the weather. Unfortunately, he drank from the sheep's trough. Months and years passed. 10 and B tried to create a copy of the late great old man with a skinny body, brown skin from the heat of the sun, and curly hair full of sand, and suddenly it started. The sky was raining a piece of snow for the first time, so Nabe decided to take shelter with the sheep under a large hill and began to eat them from his own food after the snow prevented them from their livelihood on the ground. After that, NB was surprised by the roads under the hill, and they prompted curiosity to enter and discover the place, and he kept walking until he came out in a completely different place. A young man with a weak body was coming from afar, and when he approached Najib, he ran to him and took him in his arms, and they knew that he was his friend Hakim, but unfortunately their crying broke the heart, and NB began to ask Hakim about the length of time they had been absent, but Hakim was in much worse condition than NID, and he did not realize anything, and after a while Hakim decided to run in the direction he was coming from, like a madman, and NID did not know how to blame him or himself and his condition. After a few days with the camel's sand, sheep, suddenly Hakim appeared calling for him and throwing him a paper that flew with the wind, and Hakim disappeared, and then the wind continued to blow it away and wibble and focused on it, and suddenly he heard the voice of all coffee he asked from afar, and in his place he pretended that he was relieving himself, and they forgot. He demanded to return to the farm before the storm hit. A little later Nib rang and read the paper. He knew that Hakim had moved to work near him a few days ago, so I met him in the end. He told him that there was an African young man working with him who knew the secrets of magic and that they were intending to escape together. And a few days later, Najib meets Hakim Man, his African friend, whose name was Car, and Kader tells them that the wedding of Al-Caf's daughter is coming up within a few days, and it will be the best opportunity to escape. Suddenly, Najib's heartbeats raced and changed, as if he had finally gotten used to slavery, and they forgot that he was a free, honorable person. But Hakim begged for him. Man said to him they must escape together and return to their country. As they entered this hell together, after a few days we see a gathering of the sponsor's guests. He demands on the occasion of his daughter's eating, and offers Na a piece of meat for the first time. The next morning Tuli and his nephew Khalid left. I find the imam off his daughter's wedding, sending her to the marital home, and Hold tells him that if he was late, he would be there tomorrow at the farm for a long time. Finally, the 2 millions left, and Najib began to take off his shoes and clothes completely, and he walked barefoot on the hot sand. But the feeling of freedom was enough for him, and he lowered his face under the water of the heater, and he was in pain and screaming, and he began to arrange his bag and the clothes he had arrived with, but his pants were still too wide. He became miserable, then had to tie a rope around his waist. After that, Najib decided to throw food to the sheep and camels. It was clear that they were approaching him, and calling especially the sheep that had gathered around him, he saw that had committed no sin and left his food in front of them. Then Hakim arrived with Khadro, and they continued to rush Nid, and began to run while limping, but there are smiles on his face with tears, and the poor man does not know what he is waiting for in the witches. After they have walked for continuous hours inside the witches, and the night has come upon them, they find far, and Hakim kills them. They go and drink from it, but Khadiri refuses and tells them that this is very dangerous. After urging them, Khadiri goes himself, but unfortunately the farm guards they sensed then man started expelling them and shooting them with fire, and they thought they were thieves. After a series of back and forth throughout the night, the day comes, and Khadiri is sitting praying, and when he wakes up they are surprised by a forest of sand that has no end, and their gaze does not return until the end, and H-man begin to run like poor people inside the witches, and it is shaken by the reflection of the sun on the sand, and they remember it mad. But when they arrived they found a mirage, and despite all the difficulties they did not want to miss a haul inside the desert. But one time a terrible amount of poisonous desert snakes came out, and Khadiri and Hakim were able to escape. Naj ordered that he stay in his place, but unfortunately his skin was scratched by a superficial scratch from a snake among them, and then they decided to tie him up his leg in order to continue their journey. And then Hakim falls from thirst and hunger, and Khadiri decides to carry it on his shoulder, and then NB falls, and Khadiri begins to put wet sand on their bodies, and this is to reduce the heat a little, because they are about to die from thirst. And Hakim began to delude himself again, and runs after the mirage, and began to eat sand. Unfortunately, he appeared in the throes of death, and Nid tried to call for help from Khadiri, telling him that he was trying to save Hakim, but in the end, unfortunately, he died, and Nwi took his lap, and Peter said he would forgive him. Suddenly, the ground shook hand as sandstorm appeared, and Khadiri was ready to escape, but NB was refusing to walk and leave the body of his friend, who died, so Khadiri decided to remove and run, and that at Hakim's body was buried on found of the sand. After that there was nothing in front of them, but they continued on the road despite Ned's feet, which were covered in scratches by snakes. After a whole day they were finally able to reach the well in the midst of magic, and Nabe ran over it like a madman to drink, and Car tried to run after him and stop him. He is drinking while his body is hot, and he is going to die, and his remains are near the well for hours, and then they decide to continue on their way, and after 2 hours of walking, Kata finds a bag thrown on the ground, and they start running when they feel that they are close to Alamur and the city. But after a while they discover that they are in the middle of the sand, and their sight does not meet the end of it, and days have passed. After days of suffering and salvation, Nid began to suffer from the throes of death and fainted, but the next morning he woke up to find himself alone, and poor Khadiri died the second time, and he spilled water on his bottle, and he actually drank it all in one breath and threw it so that the bottle would roll on the sand, and suddenly the asphalt appeared, and then Nabe stood up like a crazy person in front of a huge transport vehicle that stops and takes him on its way, but everyone refused, and no one wants to take him on his weight in this state. A car 2 and 3 and Najib, who starred for Magic, is about to die on the asphalt. There is a car with a very polite person inside. He hosted N and tried to reassure him and tell him he was paralyzed and rested in the car because his clothes were very bad. Then NB arrived in the city and entered one of the rooms of some workers. They were able to help him and reach the numbers and addresses of his family. He started crying after he heard the voice of his wife, Saria. After that, Najib was arrested and his signature was taken from him, saying that he had no papers or identity, and suddenly he saw that he had no papers or identity, pictures of criminals wanted by justice, and among them he noticed a picture of Khadiri, and the officer asked him if he knew anyone among them, but Nwit contented himself with tears, and then NB was shown among those fleeing from each sponsor, and each sponsor began to enter and take his worker, whom he could recognize, and beat him with a hammer until MB's eyes sparkled when he saw his sponsor, a student, coming in his direction. He began to hide behind his colleagues, but unfortunately Talib recognized him and began hitting him with a hammer. Suddenly Nag felt that he was deluded with terror and Talib was still coming in his direction, and he began to look suspiciously at him until he passed by him and came back a second time, and the cursed Talib told him that if he had been under his sponsorship, he would have returned the desert again. And here Neb has his leg not removed and is sitting on the ground crying when he realizes that Talib was not his sponsor in the first place and was considering that he had kidnapped him. Man exploited his ignorance and kindness. In the end, Najib was, and thus the events of this sad true story will end in the end. And don't forget to like and subscribe our channel.